So we're talking to students assembled from King's School, which I think is Stamford, Connecticut. Is that right? And we are going to discuss today the plays and the art of the Troubles and different narratives and the ways in which cultural avenues can be used and often reflect narratives of the Troubles and often also in the peace process. My name's Conall Parr. I'm a lecturer in history at Northumbria University, and I've written quite a lot about the Troubles and about especially the way the arts and the Troubles interact, and in terms of the way that sometimes history and politics is reflected through writers and through the theatre. So I think the essential thing to convey about the Irish Republican narrative of the Troubles is that the root cause of the conflict to Republicans lies with the British state. It lies in the partition of Ireland, which was arranged by the 1920 Government of Ireland Act, which partitioned what was then known as Southern Ireland, which only existed technically for a year, and the 26 counties of which is now the Republic of Ireland and used to be the Irish Free State. And if I can convey again anything to you about the Republican narrative, it's that the British state and the institutions which enforce British rule in the 6 counties are the main part of the problem. Their chief objection, or the chief aim of Republicans, and especially armed Republicans in the Troubles, was to remove the British presence and cause a withdrawal from Northern Ireland of the British presence in the form of the army, police force, local security forces, apparatus, and so on and so forth. The main aim of the Provisional IRA was not, as some Sinn Féin people say at the moment, equality and rights. It was to secure the British withdrawal from Ireland. That and that alone. It aimed to do this, to use a phrase of a famous American political leader, Malcolm X, by any means necessary. And that obviously includes violence. So it's worth stating the importance of language in all this. What the study of Ireland teaches you, and I think it's a really good thing for any student to learn, is that you look at the importance of language. Language tells you a lot about the conflict. It tells you it's more than code for identity and politics. It's what you'll find is many Republicans don't use the very term Northern Ireland. They call it the North of Ireland, or sometimes the 6 counties. And again, it feeds into the importance of language and what that signifies about this problem to people. And those who use certain phrases and languages to reflect their ideology and politics. Initially, it's worth saying about the Provisional IRA, they begin as a defensive force. What happens is essentially to protect Catholic communities from what were mobs of loyalists who were moving through the streets of Belfast, literally in 1969, attacking whole districts and streets, such as Bombay Street, which was literally burnt to the ground. And it was only later that the Provisional IRA went on the offensive and began a bombing campaign in England, particularly London, and against Unionist targets across Northern Ireland. Republicans didn't ignore also Unionist and Loyalist views. They knew about them, but they do hold that Unionists are a colonised population. And essentially the argument from Republicans is that Unionists have been duped by the British state to be loyal to Britain through a kind of divide and rule tactic. And you get the sense of what's called the false consciousness, is the phrase which Republicans use about Unionist ideology. So those people in Northern Ireland who identify as Unionist and British, they believe apparently are labouring under a false consciousness in this view, and they're identifying themselves as British because the British have conditioned them to believe that they're British. Needless to say, this is heavily disputed by also Unionists and Loyalists, and that kind of segues nicely into, I can bring them in to explain the narrative of the conflict from their perspective. Firstly, again, it's worth establishing that they do identify strongly as British. There are some Unionists, interestingly, who call themselves Irish Unionists, and they are happy to call themselves that, including, by the way, the founder of a party which is very important at the moment, the Democratic Unionist Party, the man who founded that party and is actually credited, I think fairly, with whipping up the Troubles in the first place. The Reverend Ian Paisley calls himself an Irish Unionist. And he's kind of comfortable in that, interestingly. And there are some others, including on the Loyalist side, who see the British Army units and the Royal Irish Rifles as being an Irish regiment. And they're kind of comfortable with that, which is an interesting part of things. But generally, they do see themselves and would insist that they are called British. And they're strongly prepared to maintain the Union, and again are prepared to use force to do that. In the context of the Troubles, I think it's intriguing to point out that Loyalists come from the Protestant working class population, and they go on the front foot for different reasons to Republicans. Firstly, it's important to remember that the first people killed in the Troubles were Loyalists in the summer of 1966. So a lot of people talk about the Loyalist violence as being reactive and in responding to IRA violence. And actually, the first people who are killed are by Loyalists. And there are different reasons for this, but it occurs through the UVF in 1966. And I think the chronology and the evidence shows that actually, therefore, the Loyalists do actually begin the Troubles in that way. Why do they do that? They're concerned in 1966 by the Republic of Ireland's commemoration of the 1916 Easter Rising. And that kind of raises tensions amongst the Protestant part of the population and increases the sense of anxiety, is how I describe it, in the Unionist and Protestant population. But also the reforms of the Unionist Prime Minister Terence O'Neill, who's sometimes forgotten as a sort of he's a kind of like, seems like an old English gent in some ways, the way he speaks in this kind of plummy English accent, and he's removed from the Protestant population on some level for that reason. Loyalist and the Unionist base are never convinced by O'Neill. So as soon as O'Neill starts talking about reforms, and even if only symbolically reaching out to Catholics by getting himself photographed with nuns and occasionally, and he meets the Irish Taoiseach, Sean the Mass, in 1965, that frightens the Unionist base. So you can see how with the commemorations of the Rising, and then with some of O'Neill's reforms, and then with the emergence of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s, this was always going to increase fear and apprehension amongst Loyalists and Unionists in Northern Ireland. Unionists unanimously regarded the civil rights movement, which, by the way, was partly influenced by the civil rights movement in the United States, the Unionists saw it uniformly as a IRA front, as just another means to destabilise and kind of get rid of the state of Northern Ireland. And actually that was quite wrong, as it turned out. Paisley arrived on the scene to exploit this with his talent for rabble-rousing and whipping up crowds with what one writer recently called a flamboyantly divisive figure, a maestro of incitement. And if it helps you imagine it, he was kind of like Donald Trump before Trump. Okay, it's that same ability to be get crowds going, play groups against one another, and also appeal genuinely to people's emotions. You have to understand that phenomenon, and Paisley taps into that. And you see in hindsight, Loyalist violence following the 66 commemoration of the Easter Rising, O'Neill's reforms. The final seal is the emergence of the Provisional IRA itself, which comes into being at the end of 1969, and as I said, goes on the front foot in the early 70s. As I said already, originally as a defensive force. And I think, though, it's important to say that once they start going and attacking, going after Protestant targets, or targets which end up being Protestant, businesses, human beings, it's resented and seen and resented by the Protestant population of Northern Ireland, and seen as such. So a famous loyalist named David Irvine, who I think is very important because he's a very articulate figure and he becomes quite an important loyalist leader, and Robert here is doing an interesting play about David Irvine, who he knew. He described how the thing which radicalised him to become involved in the conflict was the experience of an incident called Bloody Friday on the 21st of July 1972. And David Irvine describes looking across the Belfast skyline at plumes of smoke which go up, and he says that each plume is a life which is being lost. And this is the thing which makes him so angry enough to become involved, and someone who wasn't normally inclined towards that. And the Bruges IRA that day detonated 22 bombs in Belfast, across Belfast, and ended up claiming 9 lives. And I think David Irvine said that there was one guy who was called David who had the same name, and it was almost as if it was a reminder to him that it could have been him. And it was certainly something which caught up people who he knew, and shortly after he joins the UVF and commits himself to violence and the conflict. I'll end on the point about narratives by saying that people join paramilitaries and get involved for different reasons, and don't judge people. You don't know why. What judgment is being in a situation where if you were in that person's shoes, would you have acted differently? And the answer is you don't know. So don't have a moral compass or judgment about that. You need to understand and explain why people did become involved in violence and why they thought it was necessary at the time. And some wanted to hit back, in David Irvine's words, with extreme ruthlessness. In other words, it's a kind of gut emotional response to something. And you're radicalized by your experience, but for others there is an ideological dimension to it. So, as a key leader of republicanism and the IRA, Gerry Adams, and Sinn Féin, Gerry Adams comes from a family where republicanism is in his DNA, and his family kind of is obviously inculcating and putting that into him from a very early stage. And that's again an ideological aspect to it which you have to bear in mind with all this. What it is that lights the touch paper of the troubles which come along. Okay, so the second of your essential questions is about the role of the arts play in the peace process, and I think it's a very significant one, and it's something which there's been a lot more research about in recent years. The first thing I have to say is that during the Troubles itself, which we can say is roughly from the period from 1968, 1969 to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, could also be, you could put it back further, you could put it back to the 2005 decommissioning of weapons, i.e. the IRA giving its weapons up in that year, could also be an end date. Because a war is going on, it's very difficult for people to create in that scenario. If a building is on fire, it's difficult to stage a play in that building. And there's also a more general imaginative thing that writers should really have a kind of peaceful harmony in which to write and to go away and to respond to something or paint. It's not to say that people don't create art out of rubble, but by and large, I think you do find a lot of the best art tends to be from a period of years, kind of detachment which comes later. And that's what's interesting about the two gentlemen in the room today who've written after the Troubles. Again, it's not to say that a number of great writers and painters don't emerge during the Troubles. For just some names to give you, Seamus Heaney to Mary Jones, via T.P. Flanagan, Mabel Gookin, Brian Friel, Rita Duffy, Morris Leach, Stuart Parker. They're great writers and artists, painters. They do manage to create during the Troubles, during the midst of the Troubles, though a lot of them actually leave. A lot of them actually go across to England, go to different parts or Ireland, for instance. But I do, again, emphasise that I think that level of distance and that getting away from the violence often helps the art and helps the creativity to come. The actor and director Stephen Ray talks about how his company, Field Day, couldn't write what he called a balaclava play because it was still too raw and emotional. So they were addressing the Troubles in plays like Brian Friel's Translations, which was put on in 1980, through history, by going back to a previous period in Irish history to reflect on the Troubles which were currently going on. And immediately people on seeing that in Derry, Belfast and elsewhere would recognise the aspects of the Troubles within that play. But it was still not, it's still different to actually writing a Troubles play while the Troubles is occurring. Another great actor, the late James Ellis, once remarked that the great play about the Troubles is yet to be written. And there's some people who still feel that. In terms of the peace process, culture and the arts, I think, is immensely important. Especially within the Republican movement, it was identified by strategists and activists like Danny Morrison that the arts are a useful way and form to redirect the energies and passions which exist within those involved in the conflict and associated with violence. And essentially the arts becomes a kind of peaceful avenue of resistance. It becomes a way in which people can continue the conflict and advance politics by other means. Now it tends to be, as I look at it, advancing the politics, but they can also question the politics. Sometimes in the act of writing and creating, you question something. I think that does also occur, and it's also one of the reasons why this is very unique. Whatever the people's criticisms of the art and culture which has resulted from this, and these are subjective opinions anyway, there's no reason why a white middle-class critic his view is more important than a working-class woman in Belfast. These are subjective views in any case. It's hard not to welcome the fact that the arts were embraced in this way to wind the violence down. And I think that's a really unique thing we can look at. It's also no coincidence that this whole process coincides with the emergence of festivals in the late 1980s, like Féile an Phobal, West Belfast Festival, which has held so many events in this venue, and which was initially brought actually about because of to try and take away some of the tensions which arose every August. There's a bonfire tradition people forget about within the Republican community, which used to occur, and it used to be a lot of rowdy, sort of antisocial behaviour, and people in West Belfast set up the West Belfast Festival in part to try and create something where it would kind of take away from that, give people an avenue to move away from that. And it was also about catching some of this artistic and creative momentum which was going on as the conflict was winding down in other ways. And festivals such as the Féile have provided the resources and support to support this kind of nurture this kind of process. Loyalists have taken longer, I think, to adapt to the shifting sounds of the peace process, but Bobby here is Beano here is one such writer to have emerged from this background, and is, I think, very unique in his ability to convey a loyalist narrative in such a way that it can be absorbed and even appreciated by audiences outside of loyalist supporters. That's the key point to that. And outside the comfort zone, if you like. I think there are other examples of loyalists engaging with the arts that people have forgotten. There was a former leader of the UDA named Andy Thierry, who was quite a big, charismatic character, and he was involved in the writing of a play called This Is It, which comes about in the early 1980s, which is written with a community activist called Michael Hall. And there are other loyalist examples. There's a very talented painter Beano's worked with called Geordie Morrow, who does some wonderful paintings which were displayed here a few years ago in the Coquelin, and also in the well-regarded Art of the Troubles exhibition in the Ulster Museum. In another case in the early 1990s, Brian Irvin, David Irvin's brother, who's a loyalist without being a member of a paramilitary group, he produced a play called Some Day Morning about the First World War, produced by a local community theatre director named Tom McGill. Again, it's another example of a loyalist artistic initiative. A guy around Andy Thierry, a UDA leader called Sammy Duddy, brings out quite an amusing poetry pamphlet called Concrete Whirlpools of the Mind, which is also an interesting example. And there are other loyalist leaders I met and interviewed, such as Glenn Barr in Derry, who gave me copies of poems and were trying to be creative at the same time as that they were political. So it wasn't the case that loyalists lacked a creative spirit and were lifting weights just in prison. They were also reading, there was some artistic impulse there which existed. What strikes me is what they lacked, unlike the Republican movement, was the support network to be able to catch and kind of that sustained commitment from their communities for the art and literature which they were producing. And this is still a factor, and also because of the hard man reactionary associations of loyalism, and also others from the attitudes from others within unionism, they weren't willing to highlight these efforts or support them until relatively recently. And even a theme for us at the moment, and I'm on the board of the group which stages Beano's plays, is this sense in which the Phalo Festival, the West Belfast Festival, is often the festival which stages his work and which gives him the platform. You wouldn't probably get this so much from the sort of Protestant groups which have sprung up. I think that's very telling in some ways. And I think a connected problem to loyalists expressing themselves artistically is actually not so much from Republicans, it's actually the reaction from other unionists, from middle-class Protestants. And there's a sense I always find that, we found when Beno and William Mitchell, who's the artist, another former UVF prisoner who's the artistic director of etc., launched etc. in the end of July 2013, we were very struck. I think Laurence was there as well for that event in the Lennon Hall Library, and we were struck by the lack of real engagement from unionist politicians with this. If this had been on the Republican side, there would be Sinn Féin politicians present and supporting it and giving it some kind of validity and credence. And it appears to me that unionists don't like to see independent thinking within working class Protestantism and loyalism. They're not entirely comfortable with that, and they don't encourage loyalists to find their way out of the past and out of the violence which this represents, which is a very serious point. And it's very interesting when Laurence's play Green and Blue was about to be staged at what was the New Forge Country Club in October 2016, unionist politicians immediately denounced this in the media and said this was a venue which had been the subject of IRA attacks in the past. They hadn't even seen the play and they were denouncing it. It was as if the very process of doing something like that was just off limits. And again, it's quite a big problem. In the case of Beano's work, you find a stony telling silence in place of engagement from those unionist politicians. And I'll end on this point by saying that I think loyalists can be full of potential and creativity precisely because they tend to be a bit more individualist and less inclined to combine and club together in groups. I think this is it can be disputed, but this is my own theory about this. Republicans are better at working together as a group, and and to make it stronger, you make yourself stronger by being in a group and combining. Whereas loyalists, funnily enough, they're more diffuse, they're more inclined to break away and argue with each other, sometimes in a sort of petty way. But funnily enough, despite the old cliches, loyalists do have this potential in the arts, which I think is worthwhile and valuable. So the final of your essay questions I'll just cover here before introducing Beano a bit, is about political theatre and historical memory in working class communities. So I think this is an interesting one here because Beano here himself has talked about the immediacy of the theatre. He gave an interview where he said when Tartan, his second major play was coming out, where he says it has to be theatre. So though he writes poetry, there's something about theatre which is special. It is that immediate situation where you hit people on an emotional level, where you see that in actors and in the theatrical experience generally, which is kind of pretty special. And I do think this is a major. Theatres are still a kind of vital and compelling experience in that way, especially when you know it comes from somewhere very real and has been lived through. People would be surprised at the working class nature of audiences themselves in Northern Ireland over the years, because they used to tour, and they still do tour plays, to community venues like this, but also across the province, and you get a very different audience from the typical, it would be in Manhattan, you would have a very middle class, wealthy audience going to a play. Whereas here, because of that access, you do get that ability to hit a certain audience who would otherwise not see plays. So this next point is somewhat contested by certain academics I meet, and I'm prepared to discuss that with them. But for me, the theatre is a kind of safe space where the past can be explored and the unsayable said. And one of the reasons why this would be important in Northern Ireland, but without being too kind of grandiose about it, I do believe it has the ability to foster a different kind of historical understanding and to get people to reflect and remember things in different ways. I'll give an example of this from the research I've done, which comes through in my book, Inventing the Myth. A group of 5 unemployed actresses from working class backgrounds called who were launched in 1983, and the name was Charabanc Theatre Company, and they write their first play called Lay Up Your Ends, which they research where they research the history of women in the linen mills in Northern Ireland, because again, working class work is normally associated with men, but this was mainly an occupation for women. And it's very interesting, as this point in the 1990s, where people talk about women going to work and doing jobs in Ireland, and people in the north say that women used to dominate those industries here, right? They research old newspapers. They do things like historians do. They interview surviving workers, sort of legendary characters who worked in those mills, and generally read up about the prevalence of women working in the linen industry. And essentially they shone a light back into that history in a way which some people had forgotten, and brought women and a certain working class culture back into view where many people had either forgotten or wanted to forget it. And everyone who saw the play, who reviewed it, or who enjoyed it as an audience, who I spoke to, referred to this. So they helped to create a new understanding of history. And they bring that period and that set of working class women who were, in the words of Mary Jones, who was one of the members of Charabanc, our mothers, our grandmothers, back into view and memory. One other case briefly referred to is a man named Graham Reid, who had a lot of success with what were called the Billy plays, which are best known actually for being Kenneth Branagh's breakthrough performance. It was the first acting job he'd been given. And this was broadcast in the early 1980s, between 1982 and 1984, to what were millions of viewers, because it's different from nowadays where everyone has your Netflix and your digital channels and you can see whatever you like, whenever you like. Whereas then, there's sort of 3 channels. There's sort of BBC, ITV, and then Channel 4 comes along. There's a very small number of channels, so millions and millions of people who used to tune in and see these kind of dramas and reaching audiences you would never get now. But the Billy Play's signal achievement was to again reach back into history, to remind people in Northern Ireland and outside that this is a working class city. It's still a working class city in some ways, and it's much like working class cities across the UK and of course also Europe, and with an old set of values and characters such as what we would call here hard men. And it was a tough working class brawler who worked in the old shipyards and in the industry, and the main character in the Billy Plays is not Ken Branagh. It's actually his dad, Norman, who's played by legendary actor called Jimmy Ellis, and he's this memory of a hard man in Belfast that everyone knew in their street, in their working class area, who was tough and had the sort of code of honour, and had something decent in him as well as that kind of edge and distress and brawn. And you get the sense throughout the Billy Plays of this direct, kind of old black humour and warmth of a life, which again had probably been forgotten because the Troubles had overtaken the place. And the plays were appreciated beyond the religious divide, quite popular with Catholics as well as Protestants. And again, you see the way there in which drama and theatre is massively important in bringing something back. And you're seeing it more of a mass audience there because of television. So I'm going to, having gone over your essential questions there, I'm going to now introduce Bobby, or as he prefers to be known, Beano, Niblock, his nickname. as we prefer to know him, as a writer. Beano was born in Lagan Village in East Belfast, and has spoken and written quite vividly about the fairly normal Protestant working class community he grew up in. Like many, he was swept up in the convulsions of the Troubles, and I think one of the significant and intriguing contributions to writing that he's made, and to our understanding that he's made, is the identification of the tartan gang culture, which he was also a part of, and how that then transitioned into the UVF, as in one of the main loyalist paramilitary group. And it's partly because he went through it himself. So he's bringing something very authentic into that. And his first play, Tartan, focuses on this. And it's that sense in which the lads are singing the pop songs, and they kind of put the spin on what are pop hits in the early 1970s and adapt it to Belfast. And a quote from him, he said, "My gang consisted of a load of young men who just grew up together. I also belonged to the Junior Boys Brigade. I was an out-and-out Protestant who would have been part of the band." And it's like this. It's like the Billy plays, the location of the other kind of working class story and narrative that I think is very important about his writing. A critical part of his development is then when he's imprisoned. He's imprisoned for murder in the mid-1970s and spends over 17 years in prison, where he falls under what I would describe as the complicated mentorship of a loyalist icon named Gusty Spence. And Beano started writing in prison and was released then in the year of the peace process. As you say, he writes poetry and drama. It's kind of interesting. You probably need to think some more about what those different forms mean. Probably still working that out, but his first play, Reason to Believe, which is a two-hander, two actors, play was performed in August 2009. Again, it's part of the Fela and Phobble West Belfast Festival, and then followed by the more ambitious Tartan, which comes in May 2014, and ran in this venue amongst others, and depicts the rise of the Tartan gangs. And I'm going to hand over to him now to talk a bit about his work and life.
Okay, thank you, Conall. As Conall says, during the period that I was in prison, although it's one of the regrets I have actually, that I didn't write more or didn't study to write more. But certainly in those days, I would have been in what was called a compound system, where you were within a cage, but not, other than that, you weren't locked up really. And we had this free association, and a couple of times a year we would have had a concert. It was more like a morale booster for people who were there. I was one of the script writers for the concert, and that basically outside of that and letter writing, which I became prolific at, that was my writing experience within prison. It wasn't until I was released in late 89, early 1990 on a workout scheme in Crumlin Road Prison, which isn't too far from here, and went about what I would class as leading a normal life, if you could, after 16 and a half years in jail. But I went, took up with a partner, started to have children, got proper jobs. I owned a shop, and during the time that I owned the shop, that was when I began to have this interest in writing. Slightly before that, I think around maybe 94, 5, 6, there was tensions here every July around a parade that was banned in a country town called Portadown, and that parade became known as Drum Cree, which to me at that stage, when I seen young Protestants, and I mean some as young as 4 or 5, with masks and balaclavas on, throwing petrol bombs, it sort of said to me, have these people not learned anything from what I did 20 years ago? And it was very distressing to see that. So through friendship with an ex-prisoner who became the founder of EPIC, which is ex-prisoners interpretive centre, that looks after the welfare of ex-UVF and Red Hand prisoners, he helped form this organisation. He approached me and asked me could I write something around the Drumcree protests to take to youth groups, primary schools, and places where young people would gather. I did that, and it became really a testimony. And what I said in that was, look, and it was aimed at those 8, 9, 10-year-olds and young teens. What I said was, look, here's how I started off. And I know things are different now, but here's what could happen to you if you move through the ranks the way I did. I became a spectator in the early riots. I then became a rioter. I then got moved up through the ranks of the riot because I was seen as having balls, or I was seen as being a good thrower. And then when people seen that I was really keen and was towards the front of the rioting crowd, they said, look, don't be throwing that stone or that brick. Someone will throw it back. Throw that. And I was an explosive device. That's how I moved through the ranks quite quickly, from being a teenage rioter to a teenage paramilitary. And I told these kids that. And I don't know if it worked or not, but my opinion is if it did work on one person, then it was a job well done. So I'd written that there, and it gave me a notion too, right? So when I owned a shop and I had a bit of downtime, because you weren't always busy, I started writing short stories. But really, they were for me, they weren't for anyone else. I kept those and didn't show them to anyone. But around 2007, I had another close friend who was also an ex-prisoner, became very ill, and he had, it turned out that he had cancer that he wasn't going to beat. And this person was a very old friend of mine from we were kids, and he was the life and soul of any party. He was very, very outgoing. He was laugh a minute, he was a cracking, brilliant fella. But I started having thoughts about he wasn't always like that there. In quieter moments, this was the facade that he had. So it became a basis of the first play, Reason to Believe. And again, I didn't show it to anyone. But there were some people who I knew, and I liked to hear people's opinions of what I was doing rightly or wrongly. And I gave it to a couple of people. One of them, unbeknown to me, sent it to a local dramaturge who contacted me and said that she liked what she was reading, but would I agree to it having a professional reading. And three local actors and a local actress read that. They were all complimentary about it and went from there to being produced. That's basically where I started writing the drama. A lot of it, and that includes, I write more poetry and prose now, but there's not really a big difference. It's still writing, and a lot of writing, and a lot of reasons why I started writing was because I found it therapeutic, I found it relaxing, and I found that it de-stressed me. And of course, if I got it out there, it was also, you give you that feel-good factor as well. I find writing poetry and prose much less demanding than writing drama. I can find that I'm more prolific. I seem to get into the zone more, and I just find that I can do it in a more relaxed fashion. You always seem, to me, writing drama, you always seem to be pushing deadlines, you always seem to be trying to hit things at certain times, and creative writing doesn't work like that. So basically that's how I came to write, and some of the reasons why I write. I write because I feel there are stories there from a loyalist perspective worth telling that have been undertold. Not everything I write is related to my past, not everything I write is related to the troubles. I'm working on something at the moment that's based on my school days in the mid-1960s in South Belfast. And I find that easier to write than I do the drama. The Tartan play was particularly difficult to write. Not in relation to dialogue and stuff like that there, because I find the dialogue quite easy, but I found it difficult to write because I was having to approach subjects that I hadn't thought about for maybe 40 years. Some of those were painful, and there's actually some of them that were written in the first draft of that play, which I had to take out and I didn't want to put in. But they were for personal reasons. I just find, I love writing, I love getting the stories out, and I just wish that more people with a background like myself could do the same.
I think it's important to reflect on something else that Beano brought into being, which was a website called Long Kesh Inside Out. And what he was trying to produce there was to provide a forum where loyalists could write. and it would get out there and it would show again their different experiences.
Well, that's interesting. Something I probably should have mentioned. Laurence Inside Out was set up in 2012 with myself and 3 other ex-life sentence prisoners. And the idea was to encourage people of a similar background to engage with each other. Now, it was moderately successful for a period of time, but I found in the long run it wasn't worth continuing with. I withdrew from it, I went back to it, hoping that people would engage. And they didn't, basically they didn't. It was the same people, or me getting guest writers to write for that when it shouldn't be happening again. So as a sort of offshoot of that, a couple of years later I tried something else, and I tried to form a writers group called Postscriptum, written before, to again encourage people, not necessarily of an ex-prisoner background or an ex-combatant background, but loyalists, certainly loyalists, to write stories. And again, I could gather 4 or 5 people to do it, but it petered out as well. We've done a short, small booklet, we've done a couple of shows in Crumlin Road Jail, but the impetus wasn't there, and despite the amount of encouragement I gave and others gave, we just couldn't find people who wanted to share their experiences to the public. Privately, people send me stuff all the time of very, very good quality creative writing, but the proviso is don't show that to anyone else. So I have a computer inbox full of good creative writing from loyalists, and some of them, I think it's also important that some of those people who have given me stuff and told me to hold on to it. I'll give you an example, which I think is a crying shame. There was a guy I knew from my childhood who was also a member of the same organisation. He was in the Red Hand Commando, and he went to prison in 1972. Was released in 1977, and in those 5 years he kept a diary in long cages of every single day. There's a notification for every single day in that diary, and he's never shown it to anyone. He has it in a Tesco's bag in his loft. He will not show that to anyone. I've seen snippets of it, and it's absolutely fascinating. The fellow was also an officer of the command staff in there, where he was at meetings with governors and Northern Ireland officers and stuff like that. It's historically, I think it's priceless. He won't show it to anybody, and he's in very, very poor health at the moment. Some of the people who have given me stuff that I'm telling you about have since died. Their narratives have gone. What I would like to put on at this stage, though, is that one of the reasons why people are reluctant to write is because of the ongoing stuff around the Boston tapes. Those oral history projects, which the UVF also undertook in 2012 and took it to St Mary's College here in the Falls Road and to the Spectrum, where people were recorded telling of their prison life or before. Since the furore over the Boston tapes within the past few years come out, people have withdrawn that. Videos have been deleted, and people are just so reluctant to talk about it's impossible to archive material now from loyalists. Other than a handful who could name, including myself, people will not pop their head up above that parapet. And that's another reason why loyalists are at the moment reluctant to write.
I think also, just before I move on to introducing Laurence, it's just what's slightly painful about the loyalist experience that and incidents that Beno's just described there is that they often complain, loyalists, about how they're portrayed, and they're often not portrayed in things. If you see a film about the Troubles, often they just ignore the loyalist dispute completely, the loyalist angle completely, and it's about the British versus the IRA, which ironically is, though Republicans complain about their narratives being demonised as well, that's actually how I think Republicans prefer it, in the sense of see it that way. So there's very few people who've actually even explored that, and when they do, they tend to portray them a certain way. One of the other key factors in the development of the group that Beno and William Mitchell set up, etc., was there was a play by a fine Belfast dramatist called Martin Lynch called Chronicles of Laurence, which was he brought together by interviewing various paramilitaries on both sides, Republican and Loyalist, and there was a post-show discussion, I remember seeing the play actually on its first night in January 2009, and it was filled with kind of a delightful rogues gallery of different paramilitaries of different persuasions. But even that is quite unique, that you had all the provisional IRA, official IRA, Iron and Lay, UVF, UDA guys all in the same venue watching this play. But there was a post-show discussion with Danny Morrison and Martin Lynch, and Beano voiced his objections during this, as did others, loyalists, and Billy Hutchinson, another loyalist leader, said, we resent this betrayal of loyalists. You've betrayed us as we're guys who take drugs, and we want to sing our songs on the 12th of July, and we're just lifting weights, and that's not good enough. That's not how prison was for us. And quite rightly in some ways, Danny Morrison and Martin Lynch said to them, if you don't like it, you need to write your own story. Write it yourselves. So that's what Beano and certain other people have done. But to then create that avenue that Long Kesh Inside Out was, it was there for loyalists, and I'm still not sure that they've completely engaged with those avenues and channels enough as they should have. And then they still complain when something happens later on. So that is also their own responsibility to make those stories and narratives. I'm just going to go on now to introduce Laurence, who was born in 1956, I think, in Randallstown, County Antrim, and Laurence was 12 when the civil rights movement breaks out. And I think your initial, I've interviewed Laurence and always been interested by his own story and his development as someone who was again involved in those paramilitary groups, who then becomes a writer and is exploring a lot of his past and the past of this place through an artistic channel. You were, I think, sentenced in April 1977 and having been arrested the previous year, and I believe to life imprisonment as well. And Laurence was on both what were called the blanket and no wash protests, so he goes through those key episodes in the prisons, where the prisons become a crucible for the struggle in the Troubles generally. And Laurence was also one of the on the second hunger strike, and was on a hunger strike for a staggering 70 days. Now, there were people who were on hunger strike for 46 days. There was one hunger striker who died after 46 days. So, and I believe the longest hunger striker was on for 73 days, which Kieran Doherty. And so Laurence survived that and was brought off. I think it was the 11th hunger striker, and was brought off by his family when he was suffering during that hunger strike. And publishes, when he gets out of prison around about 1992, is involved in the scene which publishes a book called Nor Meekly Serve My Time, which is a major historical resource for anybody, which captures the oral testimonies and views of Republican prisoners in this time, and has also began working with a talented English director called Pam Brighton, who helped Republican prisoners at the time, and other writers generally. She was a legendary director, and she was able to get people and read very well scripts, which then were then made possible for production. And Laurence was one of the people who worked with her, and Laurence produced a stream of very interesting plays, such as the official version, and also Blue and Green, and Those You Pass on the Street, I think is still the one which I find very interesting, and also a film called Age 3 about the hunger strikes, and he's showing no signs of letting up, I'm glad to say. So I'll hand over to him now.
Okay, thank you, Conall. Yourselves for the input here. I suppose, as Conall said at the start, here, well, in Ireland generally, language, because we are a nation, or we agree to say they're from Ireland or Britain or wherever else, but on this island of storytellers down through centuries, and now that's very faded, whether it's as poets, shanachis in the past, bards, now filmmakers, whatever. We are a nation of storytellers, I think. And language is very important, and I suppose like listen to Conall's presentation, which would be about the Troubles, which I think is just a euphemism. It was to me it was a conflict, it was a war. It was the British Army's longest campaign in history, and they officially called it the campaign. So we disagree on a lot of things. When did the conflict start? Was there a conflict, not a conflict? What do we even call the place? Is it Northern Ireland, the north of Ireland? 6 counties, occupied 6 counties, whatever else. But that's all fine to have that diversity, I think. I just wanted to touch on something, I suppose, our element that Conall has raised, and the fact that Bob is here. Because some of this at Laurence, I was in Glasgow speaking at a Strathclyde University of the oral history, and there was a guy in the audience who was contact, was he studying the experience of loyalist prisoners and finding not having much access, or finding more difficult to do it. I suppose what I was trying to say at the time was that, to me, as from an outsider looking in, sometimes people can see as conflict as just religious, Catholic and Protestant, and I've never seen it. I grew up in a very mixed area. So all the immediate neighbours were Protestants, working on farms with them, etc. So I had probably a different experience from a lot of other people who joined the IRA, who grew up in very, very one community, Catholic community. So that sort of maybe influenced me a wee bit differently. But I suppose my main argument would be is that a way of framing why it ends up that maybe there's less material, because I think there is less material than Conall's mentioned earlier, in terms of media coverage, in terms of plays, all the rest of it. That if you are part of an anti-state force or movement or community, then you have to think of some vision of what's your alternative going to be. Okay, you don't like what's there? Right, tell us, what are you going to put in this place? And it may be anything from utopian Marxist society to some sort of social democratic setup. But it's going to be different from what it is here. So there's immediate dynamic towards the debate. I think this, you think that. What's the role of women? What's the role of farmers? What's the urban, rural? It raises all these topics, and therefore it's much more inclusive in terms of people, and much more inclusive in terms of gender. And if you look at republicanism, you look at the number of women who were in prison as IRA volunteers, compared to on the loyalist side, and so none of this is in any way a criticism, just to me like a reflection on history. That if you're anti-state outside the state, then you're looking to create your own sort of, so community becomes much more cohesive, much more involved. But the debate is there, the dynamic always towards debate is there. You end up in prison, big deal, that's always going to come your way. And I've had conversations and spoken on panels with former loyalists who's in. For some of them, that's when the sort of contradiction arises. They have been there to support the Crown. The people dragging them out of the court are wearing the Crown, the badge of the Crown. The people who are locking them up in jail are wearing the badge of the Crown, so the same people. Whereas for Republicans, no, this is what you're going to get. You're Irish, you're going to be locked up by the British, you're going to be treated badly by them. So there's always this dynamic towards looking for the other and challenging what's there and criticising it, and then if you're criticising that, it's about what are you going to put in this place. And I ended up, as Alan said, on the blanket protest, which went on for 5 years, and I was on it for 4.5, and on a no-wash protest for 3 years. And basically, even though I've gone on to do a doctorate and whatever else, I've said I was speaking earlier to British students, those 5 years when we had nothing, we weren't even allowed to have a pen. So Bobby Sands, who was the first one to die in hunger strike, and he was a poet and writer, had to hide the pen inside his body, had to hide the cigarette papers that he wrote on inside his body, had to smuggle them out. So to write anything was a challenge. You just sit down and, like you're doing on the computer or a pen, to actually write. So think you have something to write, then to move to writing, then to actually write it and get it out is a major thing. You have all this opposition, you're hiding this literally in your body to get that out. But it was done. And during that period, for me, it was the most educational part of my life, even though I've done other education, because it was about unlearning all of the nonsense that they had in your head. Because you suddenly discovered, by not having all these other TV, radio, newspapers, books, whatever else, that all you have is conversation, you suddenly discover you have these opinions and ideas that you never actually sat down to formulate. So what do I think of racism or different skin colour, or what do I think of, probably didn't even have feminism at that time, I wasn't aware of it. What do you think of communism? What do you think of it? What do you think of religion, abortion, all these issues that you found a totally contradictory position, but you thought this one, but then had somebody else challenged you. Well, do you think that? How come you think this? And you're suddenly going, Jesus Christ, yeah. So the whole dynamic is towards thinking, challenging, reflecting on what you're doing. And all of that sits totally neatly with your ideology, which is we're anti-state and we're out for an independent Ireland. And that period ended, and then we get into, I think at Republicans always talk about it in jail, there's the 2 E's, escape and education. So while you're planning for your escape, you're also educating yourself, because the idea is to educate, to get back outside, if you can be re-involved again in the struggle, whether it's in a military way or a political way. And we had a very extensive political education programme. I'd been very much involved in it, and in later years was in charge of it as part of the IRA's camp staff. And it was around that time, later 80s, when the whole jail transformed. They had the hunger strikes with everything on the desks, and we had a lot of more protests after that, and mass escape in 83 and such like. But then the jail settled down, and we more or less had won what we'd wanted, set out to do, which was to create the conditions in which we could then do what we want to do, which is to educate and so forth. So there's always social pressure is probably the right way, dynamic towards learning, education, reflecting on it, and that's reflecting on your own stuff and reflecting on republicanism. And actually we wrote a book called Questions of History, where we looked at Irish history from a very critical way, from an anti-church, from a secular way, from a very working class way, and a couple other different ways. So all I'm saying is, I suppose, about maybe Bobby would experience it, there's a very, you're in an environment which is encouraging it and cultivating it, and you're getting support from it, and you're getting mass of people who are involved, and or a larger number of people at various levels, because one of our biggest things was we all come from, or in the Royalist side or Republican side, working class areas. People had very little access to education, usually left school without any exams, or coming into jail with this idea of their failures. So part of our whole process was to actually encourage people to create themselves. No, you're not. You just didn't have the chance to be educated in the way that you should have been, where other people were having born in a different family, who were more wealthy than them. You would have all the degrees you wanted. And then the latter part, but then really got me into so I'd been writing a lot of political stuff and was doing it in university. And again, for Republicans doing it in university, they study the social sciences in general. So it's about the state and how the state functions and different views of the state and racism and world struggles and whatever else. And by and large, I found that loyalists were more inclined to study mathematics or art or something else. Kind of had these discussions with them, because sometimes you're discussing the state, then it throws up these issues about, well, what is your role to the state, and are you for it or against it or whatever else. But then we by chance got into poetry workshops around about 87, 88, more as a pastime, totally by chance. Somebody got a bit of a booklet that they'd been writing to a pen pal over in Sheffield, and she had sent them over a copy of this very basic, few pages, stapled together in an A5 booklet, and there's a few exercises. And in the winter, when we couldn't get out of the yard in the evening, started to do these poetry workshops. And we only had 2 rules: if you're in it, you had to write; if you wrote, you had to read it out. So you're not going to do that, don't be coming in. You know? And it was a really fascinating period, and a lot of joking, a lot of embarrassment as well. But it sort of discovered that there was all these sort of secret poets about, which was interesting, because Bobby Sands, who had been hunger strike, had been a poet and writer, and people read his poetry and all, but yet here was these other people who were now writing, and they were hiding it inside books and all the rest of it, in case anybody seen what they're doing. And what that led on to was then, I suppose it was a shift from all the sort of political studies and political writings into a more creative way, and the first one was into poetry. And this is an area, it's an act of gross self-promotion that I published this year last November, which is, Threads refers back to the blanket protest, that's in the Threads of the blanket, but it was poetry that half of it was wrote in prison, more as a hobby later on, and then when I got out of jail. But it led on to that sort of more now focus on creativity, and in 1989 we set up the magazine, which would be written entirely by prisoners, whether they were in our jail, Laurence, or the women's jail, Armagh, or in Portlaoise in the south of Ireland, or in America, or Europe, or else, but they'd be Republican prisoners. It was all done clandestinely. Stuff had to be smuggled into us. It was my friend I wrote with, Brian Campbell. He was appointed. I was out to set it up, and then he was appointed as the editor to do it. And it's compiled and smuggled out all the rest of it. Later years, we were able to do it through the prison, and it continued for the next 10 years, 3 times a year, published on the outside and sold on the outside. And why we did it was, or editorial, a lot of it's available online, was that we wanted to write our own history, because nobody else was going to write our history. So it refers back to what Conall said there about lawyers, who's writing, or what Donnie Morrison might have said at the time, or Martin Lynch. We felt the same, even if there were people who were sympathetic in the rest of our politics or our struggle or whatever else happened, we were never going to get it right. We should be doing it ourselves. No reason why we shouldn't be doing it. And the other thing we wanted then to use was a magazine to raise topical issues, to reflect back on our own community as in the Republican community. And I think it's something that Fianna Fáil does very well by inviting in speakers, and from its very start, inviting in people from the loyalist and unionist community, because we want to hear that, because it generally fits in with, well, okay, we're thinking this, well, what do they think, so okay, how could we combine that? I think when you're on the pro-state force, then the whole thing is about maintaining the status quo. You hold what you have. Don't be dabbling with any other sort of airy-fairy ideas and all the rest of it. No, this is it. Here, so there's no dynamic towards starting to reflect and saying, well, maybe we should think of this and maybe think of that. You know? I thought it really fascinating. Like last year, Peter Robinson, who was a leader for many years of the Democratic Unionist Party, when he was speaking at the McGill Summer School up in Donegal, and he made reference to the whole idea of maybe a border poll and about Irish reunification. And what he says that I don't believe my house is going on fire, but I buy house insurance just to play safe. You know, it's okay just to be aware that that's happening. So maybe we should just discuss this and look at it. And the level of backlash he got from people who had been his closest colleagues for years, that he even dared mention it, because it's almost that to mention it is to say, well, like, this actually might happen, and by you mention it, you're actually starting the process to go forward. So I think, for my view as a Republican, I don't want to speak for Bobby, but there's not that encouraging and reassuring thing, because to start to question anything at all can be, you're moving outside the box, whereas I think Republicanism has matured. So I think the most recent play I did was called Green and Blue. It's based on an oral archive of former RUC officers that served on the border and former guards. And people be amazed that I wrote it because of my background. And I said, I'm a problem writing it, because I understand that people, depending on where they grew up, depending on their experiences, they went down a certain path, I went down a certain other path. I don't have an issue with them as people. And I wrote the story, and I did a brilliant review of it at the time, and said it was dealt sensitively. It was put on the other week in the Felons Club, which is former IRA prisoners in Uri. It's played in the Felons Club up here. It's played in Middle South Armagh. People who are all ex-IRA and all come along and go. And it was on the Felons up here. Betty Carlisle from Shankill Women's Centre came over. Her son went downstairs afterwards, have a drink. Her son's actually saying, "Mom, we better get out of here." And she says, "Why?" She says, "Well, we're really not with Provies who will stay here any longer." Because they're all. So there's a more, as I say, you're working in an environment in that way, which I think is encouraging. But I think even though it is that way, there's always a need for writers, whether they're poets, writers, playwrights, to then reflect back on your own experience, and which is why I'm glad that actually Green and Blue has been taken into those areas I'm talking about, because it's been seen by Republicans who are then hearing. It was on Coal Island, which is a really Republican town in County Tyrone, and there's a young guy in the audience who's now the chair of Ogra Sinn Féin, which is Young Sinn Féin. And he said, I came along the other night expecting to hate him. He was the character on stage, and he says, "Well, I couldn't help myself, but I ended up feeling sorry for him." So he says, "I'm delighted I came," and that's, to me, that's the role of the artist to engage with. I'm still a Republican. I have my issues with RUC, but I don't have an issue with an individual who goes a particular way, and that's their experience, and it's different from mine. And I think the unfortunate thing is that there isn't that same sort of mass number or something. That's why I applaud Bobby for what he does, because it's a more lonely route or a more sort of unsupported route. I know me and Brian Campbell wrote a play as far back as 2003 called A Cold House, which again was about the experience of a former Republican prisoner who's a heating technician, goes to a house to fix a boiler, and the house is owned by a former RUC man policeman. So they don't know each other when they get into the house, but then through a parade of, let's go, you go and where do you drink that, and where do you, no, they discover who's who, and then there's a big sort of argument on it as to what it's about. And whenever we were writing it, because we wanted to be authentic, we spoke to a number of former RUC people, which was facilitated through an organisation then called Mediation Network, or Mediation Ireland. It's Brendan McCallister. And I remember me and Brian meeting this guy down in Botanic Avenue in Belfast over dinner. And I've always wondered why he actually came, or why he agreed, and I think it was that he wanted to tell a story. We had a table like yours. I was sitting across from him, Brian was sitting beside me, and Brendan McCallister was there. And we said this, we were writing a story or a play, and we want to hear now, what would you say to this former Republican prisoner? And he was literally sitting with us here. He wanted to this fork one time, it just fell, and he was literally shaking. He said, I just see this as terrorists and criminals. So that's fine, we're not asking you to say it. Like, so tell us, like, what would you say, and we'll faithfully record your words. And he told us, they'd be picking up pieces of bodies and putting them into plastic bags after used bastards set off their bombs. It's a really, and that's what he wrote in the play. And it was put on by Tom Brighton, who was the BBC Northern Ireland editor for radio plays, but she also set over a company double joint. And so it was played in Ballymurphy. It was a real Republican area, and it didn't go down that well. It was applauded and all the rest of it, politely, and me and Brian got away with it because of our background literally. But what we did was, what we wanted to do was to say, and one woman what was afterwards in the audience, whose husband had been killed in Ballymurphy by the British Army, and she says, the number of times I wanted to shout up with him, an RUC man, and say, I'll fucking tell you how it is, like that. And then it was, well, what about? And then she says, I thought, because she was in Sinn Féin, it was 2003, so it wasn't a sort of generous time out there. I think the Assembly was still down then also. And then she thought, says, if what we say we're on about and what we're trying to do is move forward and create this new society, I have to hear this. And I remember telling her, Margaret, for nobody ever mentions anything again. That made it worthwhile. And that's what I see the role of it as being, is to sometimes tell our own story, but at the same time to reflect back and challenge ourselves in our own story, because the only thing that we can be sure of is change. It's going to happen, and I suppose what I see is the real unfortunate thing on the loyalist side, that we don't hear those stories, and yet I have a lot of contacts there, and when you meet the people, they have the same interests and the same thoughts and the same commitment to their community, but somehow, well, on one hand, in terms of political representation, it seems to sort of be totally lost. But in terms of media or artful expression or whatever, it seems to be a whole thing of, and I don't know, it totally goes back to my argument that to even start to criticise the state is somehow to be disloyal and not therefore to be encouraged, or certainly dangerous or whatever. Whereas generally, by and large, I'm sure some Republicans get pissed off that I write something about Ernie Seaman, but in a sympathetic way, but in general, it's not a big deal, it's like, yeah, I can see that. Still don't like the RUC, but yeah, I can understand how your man got there, so I live it at that.
So we're very grateful to King's School for facilitating this, and it's one of these ways in which dialogue occurs and in which there are conversations about the past, and which hopefully offer a kind of education and an understanding of the conflict to people both inside and outside of here. I think all of these kind of events matter, and thank you for taking part. So we're talking to students assembled from King's School, which I think is Stamford, Connecticut. Is that right? And we are going to discuss today the plays and the art of the Troubles and different narratives and the ways in which cultural avenues can be used and often reflect narratives of the Troubles and often also in the peace process.